Well, it's an honor to be with you all, and I've enjoyed being a part of the discussions, and now look forward to continuing. But as I was sitting and listening to Nola's presentation, a thought occurred, and that is kind of an overwhelming thought. Why bother? Why bother? You know, this litany of facts and statistics and trends that just seem completely overwhelming. And as I was sitting next to Peter, as we were describing ourselves as backbenchers here in the room, why bother? Wasn't it tempting to listen to Nola and say, wow, you know what, I'm just going to step back from all this. I'm just going to make sure that my marriage is good. I'm going to make sure that my children are secure. I'm going to make sure that my community in this little enclave is fine. And who really cares about what happens with everybody else? Isn't that a temptation? And if it's not a temptation to you, it's a temptation to me. And so why do we bother? Well, we bother because we serve a Lord who comes and corrects. And if you open up and you look at sort of large chunks of Scripture, sometime take a look at the Gospel of Mark. As you know, Mark was the first Gospel, and when it opens with the adult ministry of Jesus. And you can categorize sort of the large swaths of time that Jesus uses from his baptism up until the Passion, and it fits into three major categories, not exclusively, but three big chunks. One is teaching, one is healing, and one is correcting. And that's what I want to focus in on today. It's this notion of correction. So the Lord comes along, and think about this. I'll give you a few examples, and then we're going to get to how we are to correct our own societies, but we've got good ground on this. So Jesus is out and about, and you know the story. He and the disciples are pulling tassels and eating the food, and that's scandalizing that they're eating the grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus, the creator of the Sabbath, corrects the Pharisees, and he says, you don't understand this. You don't understand the Sabbath. You are experiencing the Sabbath as a burden and a difficulty and compliance and legalism, and it's completely overwhelming. The Sabbath was made for you. You weren't made for the Sabbath. Or similarly, Jesus corrects on what obedience means. Again, the Pharisees criticize his disciples who are eating with unclean hands, and Jesus really lays into them at this point. He says, you're hypocrites. You don't know what obedience is, and you're familiar with that story. Or Jesus, when he admonishes his own disciples, who in the Near East at that time, they have this relationship with children, which is very off-putting, and children were to be seen and not heard and so forth. And Jesus says something that's very controversial. Let the children come to me. He corrects the current culture from what they're doing as it relates to their interaction with children. He does the same thing when he's confronted with discussions about divorce. And he says, you don't even understand the whole purpose of marriage. In other words, you're nickel and diming over here. You're parsing and you're arguing about what marriage and divorce is when you don't realize the joy and the beauty of a man and woman coming together as one flesh and the power of that, he's basically saying. And he corrects in an arena that we've been talking about all this week. He corrects as it relates to the public square. Now, how does he do that? He does that when he's confronted about the question of paying taxes. Now, taxation at that time and taxation today is very controversial. So controversial that Nola doesn't even like to talk about taxation. She's not really a fan of tax policy. And so it's rippled now for 2 millennia. So now we've got a situation where Jesus is put into a rhetorical trick bag. And they're asking, what should you do? And as we all know, he takes the coin, he looks at it, and he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and render unto God the things that are God's. In that moment, what he is doing is he is correcting. He's correcting around the relationship that we have with our government. And I'm going to read to you a quote from nearly 150 years ago. Lord Acton said these words of that dramatic scene in the gospel. He said, when Christ said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God," those words gave to the civil power under the protection of conscience a sacredness it had never enjoyed and bounds it had never acknowledged. And they were the repudiation of absolutism and the inauguration of freedom. Again, a sacredness it had never enjoyed and bounds it had never acknowledged. Okay, that's the environment that we step into. So now we are called as Christian believers to operate within this sphere, to operate with this notion of, yeah, we're here, and in some cases we're here to correct, we're here to improve, we're here to work, we're here to make things better. And with a sense of clarity, when it is clear, we have an obligation then to move forward into these scenes. So I've mentioned this in a couple of other settings earlier, and so just bear with me, but we find ourselves in a culture in Europe, a culture in America, where there is very little confidence in large public systems these days. And there's an anxiety that's out there that's just palpable. I was just reading on a Wall Street Journal app this morning about high employment rates in the United States right now. And yet the economy is moving, it is flourishing, but the article goes on to describe, but why aren't we very happy? Why aren't we very satisfied? And so there is this anxiety in one element that's running through our culture. There is a dissatisfaction that's running through the culture. There's a lack of confidence that's running through the culture. And now we show up, and we are on the scene. And how are we to interact? I think it's interesting to look at how Paul interacted in some of these areas. So Paul used tools, didn't he? He used legal tools. He used rhetorical tools that were at his disposal. So it's not as if Paul stepped back in these different situations and receded from the public square, so to speak. It's not if he simply relied on others to intervene on his behalf. He used the tools that he was given. He used the rights that he was given. So you know, when he was later in his ministry, late in the book of Acts, when he is brought up and he's in Jerusalem and he's arrested, and the Roman commander says, "Hey, we're gonna examine him through scourging," and then Paul is about to be scourged, and he looks at the. You can just imagine this. He looks at the centurion who's about to just tear him to shreds, and says, "Is it legal for you to do this to a Roman citizen who's never been tried?" You can imagine this centurion who now goes white-faced with the notion that this guy knows the law, he's a Roman citizen, I'm about to do this, and from my understanding of Roman law, if you administer an injustice like that, it's turned around on you. So the centurion then goes to the commander and basically says, "Hey, this guy's a Roman citizen." And the commander then backs off. So Paul uses the legal rights under the law as a Roman citizen to defend himself. He doesn't just cower away. He doesn't just sit back and say, "I'm just going to take this." No, he uses his legal rights. In a scene quickly following that, he uses a rhetorical trick. Those of you who are active in politics, you know what a wedge issue is. A wedge issue is an issue that's meant to divide your opponents. It's a classic political trick. It's a classic rhetorical trick. And Paul uses it. When does he use it? He uses it right after when the Roman commander basically foists him, because he doesn't want to deal with him. He foists him on the Sanhedrin and says, "You try him." Tells the Jewish leaders, "You try him." And Paul's in front of the Sanhedrin giving a lengthy explanation for his faith. And at one point he realizes, this is a divided group. I'm going to divide them further. Old trick. He says, brothers, I'm appealing to you. I'm a Pharisee. I'm appealing to you because I'm being criticized and I'm being tried because I believe in the resurrection. Because part of the group believed in the resurrection, part of the group who were Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. So what I'm describing to you is Paul using these techniques. Paul using various legal remedies that were there, that were set up for him, and he deployed them. And in those examples, he was successful. Now, it's tempting. It's really tempting, and I find myself tempted to sit back and just to say, you know what, it's like, it's too much. I mean, those statistics that Nola was going over, they are overwhelming statistics, overwhelming trends that are coming at us at a pace at which is nearly breathtaking. And yet Scripture tells us, we've touched on this a little bit, but this notion that goes back, we've quoted St. Ambrose from the 4th century, we don't impose, we propose. But the seeds of that actually go back to Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 and into 13. At the end of 1 Corinthians 12, he's gone through this very difficult and nettlesome and complicated explanation of the body of Christ. And the subtext of all that is, how are all these different parts to work together? And it's very, very difficult. You can tell it's a big hassle. It's a lot of drama. It's a lot of anxiety. And it's a lot of tension in the Corinthian church that he's trying to speak to. But at the end of that chapter, he says, let me tell you a more excellent way. And that's the introduction to the love chapter, which completely eclipses all the other questions as it relates to the body of Christ and how we're to act with one another. Because then Paul basically says, if we love one another in the same way that Jesus loved us, it's a great remedy for all these things. And so we're called into a more excellent way. So what Nola was talking about earlier in terms of online protection and these various case studies that she elicited were very, very interesting, because she could talk to any audience. She could basically appeal to some people on the basis of their faith. She could appeal to other people to say, this is a more excellent way. This is going to create a better outcome for the children in this culture if we do this. This is going to save families if we do that. Very, very much in the same way that Paul interacted in the public square. You'll remember that when he was in Athens, what did he do? He appealed to the Athenians on the basis of what he saw around him and what he saw around them. He looks and he says, "Well, that's the idol to the unknown God. Let me tell you about this unknown God, this God with no name. Let me introduce you to him." He didn't appeal to texts in Isaiah. Why? Because it wouldn't have been dispositive for them. It wouldn't have been influential for them. When he was at the synagogue, he appealed to the Old Testament texts, but not there. And so Peter tells us that we are supposed to be people who can give an account for the hope that is within us. And the hope that is within us is completely irrational from the world's perspective. There's no explaining it. But the hope within us has a buoyancy that is to be incredibly attractive. All right, so we're coaxed out into this public square, and this public square that can be actually quite daunting. Most of us in this room, and I put myself right at the front of this parade, have never suffered one iota for the gospel. I haven't. Some of you have. Most of you haven't. And so what's happening, I think, in many Western cultures is there's this underlying assumption that the life that we have lived, that is free from persecution, is normal. And we have come to expect these overwhelmingly positive cultural attributes to be sort of the normal water table, that is, the normal state of things, the normal environment. We walk into the room And we expect, well, certainly these things are normative for us. And here's what they are among them. Freedom to assemble. Freedom to worship. Freedom to travel. Freedom to associate, to publish, to speak, to broadcast, to subsidize, to educate, to earn, to tweet, to evangelize, to litigate, to criticize, freedom from taxation, one thing after another after another. All of these things we expect as normal. Now, I would submit to you that if you're home next week and you are at your place of worship and there are law enforcement people that are walking around outside of your house of worship, you're probably not in a panic. Why? Because you will assume in most of our cultures and in most of our countries that those law enforcement people are there to help us. I would assume that. If I'm worshiping at church at home and I would see police cars, I would think, oh, there's a leak in the fuel system somewhere. Or there's a bad traffic accident. I would not assume for a second that they're there to do me harm, or that they're there to write down my name, or that they're there to undermine me in some ways. And I know that there are some of you who have had that experience, but the overwhelming majority of us have not. And the challenge I find is that when we think that is normal, then our responses are different. Let me put it another way. There's a Bible translator named J.B. Phillips. And Phillips wrote a book, so British, contemporary of Lewis, mid-1950s. He's translating the Bible. He translates the New Testament, and it's a very, very good translation, and I commend it to you. He also wrote a book that my mother gave me, and so this is a word to you. Read books that your mother gives you. And the book is called A Ring of Truth. And in it, Phillips writes about the Scriptures and writes about his experience spending decades of studying the Scriptures. And he basically says these texts are different. These texts are alive. They're special. They're different than other ancient texts, these Scriptures. They have the ring of truth to them. And I'm going to read you a couple, 3-4 sentences that was basically a revelation that came, or an understanding that came to Phillips that has had a significant impact on me. And that is, what is our heritage as Christian believers? Our heritage as Christian believers is not the limitation that goes back to 2 centuries in the United States with religious liberties and so forth. While that's been great for the past couple of centuries, our heritage predates all of that. Our heritage goes way before that. Here's our heritage, and this is Phillips writing. He says, I was impressed by the fact that the New Testament letters were written not in some holy retreat, but sometimes from prison, sometimes from ordinary, probably Christian homes. Moreover, they were written to people who were called to live Christian lives in a thoroughly pagan world. Moral standards of all kinds were low, and there was nothing remotely resembling a Christian public opinion. There were no Sundays, no church buildings, and very little leisure for most people. Slavery was everywhere, and so was dire poverty and unrelieved sickness and disease. The great persecutions hadn't yet started, but smaller ones had. A man could lose not only his friends, but his livelihood in a place like Ephesus if it became known publicly that he did not believe in the goddess Diana. A man could very easily be looked at askance if he disavowed the local gods, and he could be considered very odd if he broke with his previous companions in alcoholic revelings. And it could have been very easy to frame a charge against a man who set Jesus Christ above the emperor of the Roman Empire. Okay, friends, that's our heritage. So when we're looking out with anxiety and trepidation about sort of the gathering storm, and you've got to be completely obtuse not to see it. You've got to be completely obtuse not to see the systemic limitations of the public square for people of faith, and more and more and more being narrowed down to sort of this pietistic view of, yeah, think what you want, talk to your little friends on Sunday morning, but that's really all the interest that we have in what you have to say. And you can press your nose up against the glass and look in on what's happening in the public square, but we really have no interest in what you have to say. That's where it's going. And yet, we've been here before. The church has been here before. And so I think therein lies our opportunity. And I'm not being fatalistic, and I'm not trying to be alarmist, and I'm not trying to be add a level of fear and anxiety to an already pretty tempestuous situation. But what I'm trying to do is have us open our eyes to what's going on around us, and to be encouraged by the notion that we as a people, our spiritual DNA has been here before. And so let me just close. I want to close by giving you two things. One is reading from Ephesians 6, which really speaks to where we are from a spiritual point of view and the tools that we have at our disposal. Be strong, not in yourselves, but in the Lord, in the power of his boundless resource. Put on God's complete armor so that you can resist all the devil's methods of attack. For our fight is not against any physical enemy. It is against organizations and powers that are spiritual. We are up against the unseen power that controls this dark world and spiritual agents from the very headquarters of evil. And then he tells us, put on the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the gospel of peace on your feet, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, the word of God, the shield of faith, and pray at all times. That's it. That's the whole thing. And notwithstanding what we see out there, notwithstanding any other trends, we know that we should bother. So rather than sitting back and being overwhelmed and saying we're not going to bother, we're told by the Lord, by his example, that he comes and he corrects. And when we see things that need correcting, when we see a better way, when we see a more excellent way, we've got a duty and an obligation to go out and to use the tools that are there at our disposal, to be wise about them. We are free people in free societies, and we have voice. And as we have voice, we need to use that voice. I just want to close by giving you a couple of lines from a friend of mine. I don't have many, like, singer-songwriter. I always think that sounds so cool. I don't have many singer-songwriter friends, but I do have one. And his name is Billy Sprague, and he wrote a song called Nothing Sacred. And I'm going to read you some of the lyrics of this. And as you are thinking about this, think about this in the context of what the gospel has to offer. What the truth of Jesus, the truth claims of Jesus, to a world that is hungry and desperate and anxious and feeling out in the cold and not knowing where to go. So listen. People need true love but chase infatuation. They need a hope but live on short supply. People need wisdom but get more education. People need forgiveness but settle things eye for eye. People need identity but are satisfied with titles. They need true courage but bravado looks sincere. People need a living God but seem content with idols. Most need destinies but settle for careers. People need faith but place their bets on science. People need a refuge but stay out in the rain. People need each other but rely on self-reliance. People need a Christmas but settle for a holiday. People need dignity but survive on ego. People need the truth but will take an alibi. People need a savior but much prefer a hero. Most long for heaven but is settled for the sky. Okay, so we are people of good news. We are the ones that, not through arrogance, not through anything that we've done, not because we're brilliant, but the truth has been revealed to us. It's been revealed to us with the Holy Spirit working in our lives. It is revealed to us through Scripture. It is revealed to us through our heritage and our predecessors in the church who have come to teach us and understand. and form doctrines. And we are now applying that, and we are applying that ever new. Ever new. And so the same level, the palpable level of anxiety that people are experiencing today, we have the remedy. And not only do we have the remedy, we've got a duty to go forward and to explain these things. Last word. Did I say last word about 3 times already? So last word. Elizabeth and I have 4 children. One of our daughters, her name is Frankie. Frankie started, she went to university, and in the university setting, she was observing her peer group who were completely overwhelmed by life. And when I say overwhelmed, I mean cascadingly overwhelmed. Many of them were drinking to the point of oblivion, passing out, blackout drunk. Many of them are really struggling with depression. Many of them are struggling with all kinds of things. And years before, Elizabeth had taken 2 of our daughters, Frankie and Gracie, had taken them down to the Dominican Republic to work in an orphanage down there. And this work, this time, particularly for Frankie, became foundational for her. And she had subsequently gone back many, many times to the Dominican Republic and was working in this orphanage with some frequency. 2 weeks here, 6 weeks there, summers. And what she would end up doing to some of her friends who she was coming alongside and were so troubled, she said, "You need to come with me, and we need to go down to the Dominican Republic together, and we need to work in this orphanage. You need to come with me." And remarkably, Frankie's got this great gift of leadership and persuasion. Kids would go with her. And she's probably led, what would you say, 60 kids down there over the course of her time in the university. And Frankie, I was listening to her. She was interviewed on the radio, which is a little unsettling to listen to your child interviewed on the radio. But she said something that was interesting that resonated with me. She said, "Joy is where 2 poverties meet." Joy is where 2 poverties meet. So what she was describing in this situation was the poverty of the Dominican kids, incredibly poor by every standard. But the spiritual poverty of these American college students who are coming down and interacting with them. And what was happening was, as these 2 groups were interacting, they were finding joy in one another. And so, what I'm suggesting is that sort of approach. And Frankie then started an organization, it's spreadjoynow.org. I can tell you more about that later. But there is a buoyancy, and there is an attractiveness, and there is a winsomeness to the gospel if we are faithful in seeing how that is to be applied. Notwithstanding gathering storms. And so we need to be encouraged. We need to realize that we've got a real responsibility here, and that many of the world's remedies are just falling short, and many of the world's approaches to things are falling short. I've served a long time in elected office in the United States, and I've seen false claims and false hopes of things that were meant to be the be-all, end-all, and do-all, these big solutions. But ultimately, we know that the solution is an introduction and a saving knowledge of Jesus. The question was, did we miss something historically? And at some point, was there a lapse, and did we lose an opportunity? I think that there was a time in that there was this notion that being involved in the arts in particular, and being involved in politics in particular, were perceived to be too worldly. And as a result, there was, I think, a movement to step back from those things in this notion to stay spiritually pure and so forth, which is not an irrational motivation. But it turns out it was a bad decision, because what it did was, in some cases, it just receded the space and allowed other influences to fill that space. I think that was a strategic mistake, and I think that as a result, so much of the entertainment industry today is, it's really hostile to the faith. So you'll see, religious figures in many cases who are portrayed in films very negatively, selfishly, and manipulators and so forth. And that will take a long time to correct. So in answer to your question, I think there was a strategic error that predates us, and we need to be mindful not to fall into that trap. It's interesting. There's a movement within the Catholic Church. It's called Opus Dei. I'm not a member of it, but Opus Dei basically says, look, God is present in all of these things, and it's very much a holistic approach to say we need to be living out the Christian faith in all of these professions. And there's, I think, great strength in that, and we need to be following that example. Well, so the question is, are we downtrodden enough to really experience this? And so, yeah. So, over your left shoulder is Timothy, who escaped from North Korea. So he's got a firsthand and a completely unique perspective on suffering and injustice and persevering through that. Most of us don't have that. And I would imagine that Timothy has a sense of clarity that you and I lack. Why? Based on his experience. They do these interviews here, for speakers, and they put a microphone in front of you and give you a snappy little question and all that sort of stuff for later on. And one of the questions, and it was a provocative question, should we welcome persecution? I'm like, oh, great, yeah. Not me. No. I don't want to jump in that pool. But you can imagine those are, when the disciples, when the apostles in the early years, early days were beaten, they counted it as a great privilege to suffer for the name. That's what Acts says. And when we're to count it all joy, those are words of comfort when you're in that situation. So I'm not for a second saying, wow, that's the head of the pack. I don't want to be the head of the pack. It's frightening to me. It's overwhelming to me. And yet you can imagine that happening. And what we should be mindful of is we should be praying earnestly that we will be faithful throughout it all. And it's amazing, you look at our brothers and sisters historically, you look at what brothers and sisters are dealing with around the world as we speak, and their faithfulness and their courage and the Lord's presence and how it manifests itself in their lives is overwhelming. It is overwhelming to me. And so, but one of the things that I imagine, I don't know this because I've never suffered, one of the things that I imagine is that there is a sense of clarity that comes along when there's nothing else for you to hold on to. And I think that the Lord reveals himself to those people in special ways and carries them through that time in special ways. There's a silly analogy. I'm almost embarrassed to make it, but we went on a father-daughter trip into the mountains of our daughter. She was 10 years old, and we're a bunch of dads, and we're stomping through the mountains with our daughters. And this guy, at the very beginning, he said, oh, I brought these clean pair of socks, and I was looking forward to putting on clean pair of socks every day. But he says that by the end of the trip, we were all such a mess, he didn't even care about any of that. And it was sort of this stripping away and stripping away and stripping away. And so you were then in relationship with your child, and it was really quite a beautiful experience. And what I'm describing is that downtrodden nature. That's who we are, and that's where we've been. And so much in America and in other parts of the West, it's been Christians who've been at the top of the heap for a long time. And we've been comparatively an incredibly wealthy group of people, incredibly wealthy. And we've had a lot of power, and you can sense those days maybe waning. And I don't long for them, but we want to be ready if they appear in our lifetime. So Peter pointed out, he said, America's been active in the past in terms of Christian engagement in the public square. What are examples to emulate and what are things to avoid? Things to emulate. The ecumenism of the trenches. Now that's not a phrase that I came up with, somebody else came up with it. But I think there's a lot of wisdom there. And there is a danger becoming so balkanized within Christian silos. And there's a temptation even here in this conference to become so balkanized in terms of Christian silos and Christian identity that we're not realizing this common ground that we have with other people who claim the name and the divinity of Jesus Christ and believe in his birth, death, and resurrection and relationship with him. And so if we become so siloed, number one, I think it grieves the Holy Spirit. Jesus' last prayer in the Gospel of John, Father, he's praying for unity for us. Yet the world looks at Christians and they can hardly figure us out. Because in the United States, we got the first church of this and the second church of that and this church and that church and all that. And while there's some ways of beauty to that, in some ways it's a symptom of real fragmentation. And so I would say be mindful of other Christian denominations. You don't have to agree with every element of every bit of theology, but you have to agree on the core. Or as Lewis said, mere Christianity. And I think sometimes there's this temptation to put on our jersey and to run with our team and not be mindful that we have these things in common across denominational lines. So again, going back to Lewis said, I have much more in common. Lewis looked at the church as, with Jesus in the center, these denominational lines falling around it. The closer you get to the center, the closer you are to one another across those lines, and the more you have in common than you do with somebody who's out here on the edge of the circle. And I don't think we're performing well in that area. And there's a lot of critics of Christians who love to see Christian division, who love to see criticism among Christians. And I would say that's an area that we need to be very circumspect when we're criticizing others. And there's really, and I'm not talking about walking away from criticism of heresy, but you take my point. There's a subtlety to this. So I would say that's, and I don't know if the United States is so good at that or so bad at that. I do know that I've been in the trenches with a wide range of Christian traditions, and I'm always grateful for more friends on all of these interactions. And I've never stopped somebody and said, you know what? What's your view of those Old Testament books? What's your view of purgatory? You know what I mean? It's like, come on, jump in the trenches and let's get about this. So the question is, how do you deal with a multifaceted public square where we're not the only voice, although we do have strong opinions about things? And this is kind of what your points was. It was like, look, you can propose all you want, but when you're talking about changes in the law have the enforcement of the law. And so you are really kind of imposing when you're doing that. I think one of the things, go back to Paul. So when Paul was interacting with some of the churches, he wanted them to give a gift, but he wanted them to give a gift for the right reason. And he was kind of working them. He was instructing them, and there's a subtlety to Paul's language that's not so subtle. That's basically, I'm not saying you owe me, but I'm just saying. Or, I want you to give, but you should give. And so therein lies, I think, part of the tension that you've spoken right to. And I don't have an easy answer for that. But I do know that we need to be persuasive. So go back to Nola's point that she was making earlier in the morning. there's a crisis that's emerging in Western cultures as it relates to this online situation. And it doesn't have to matter what your background is. There should be, that should be a point at which nearly everybody can agree. Conservative Christians, Muslim families, LGBT folks. Let's agree here that there's a level of exposure that children shouldn't have and a level of protection that they should have. And let's isolate this. Let's have a discussion around this. Let's build a coalition around this. And let's take on the internet companies. We can do this. That becomes a really interesting thing to do. Now, that's not to say that, that you agree on all this other agenda, because you don't agree on a lot of the other agenda. But it is to say that the next thing that comes along, it may be a little bit easier to work out. Or what can happen is somebody can say, look, we don't agree with you on this, and we're not going to vote for your program, but we're not going to kick and scream either. We're just going to vote no. But we're not going to put it all over the internet. We're not going to have candlelight vigils and marches and this, that, or the other thing. We're just going to vote no. Now, how does that happen? That happens out of relationship. And that happens out of, okay, I get it. We're not for that, but we can kind of lower the wattage. And so there's a subtlety to politics. There's a subtlety to the public square. And much of it is based on relationship. I don't know if I shared this story, and Elizabeth last night, as wives do, corrected my story. So there's a man named John Lewis who is a very admirable figure, in my opinion, in the United States. He was part of the civil rights movement. And the year that I was born, John Lewis was riding buses in the American South, integrating them. This is the summer of 1961. And he met with violence. And he met with violence for a principle, and that was to make, help America out of its racist past into something that was better. And I got to know him. He and I were counterparts. We were on opposite ends of the political spectrum. But I made an effort to get to know him personally and made an effort to learn about him, to read his autobiography, to give his autobiography to other colleagues on this committee. Elizabeth is an oil painter and painted a painting that we gave a print to honor him and so forth. So we developed a relationship. Now, our politics on most issues, overwhelming issues, are opposite ends. Roskam, yes. Lewis, no. Lewis, yes. Roskam, no. In the committee, all through Congress, and so forth. But we've developed a rapport. So when an issue came up that involved the abuse of power, he and I were able to work together, in part based on this relationship. So what I'm describing is sort of a subtlety to these things, and a way in which we need to approach them with wisdom and delicacy, but also clarity about what we believe in. So the question was, how has faith informed my voting patterns? And so the way I've encountered this is, I described this earlier in a session, but during the course of a campaign, you are disclosing to the public these values that are important to you. And then it should be no surprise to them that you follow through the way in which you've said you were going to vote. And so, the top issue that comes to mind is the life issue, the issue around abortion and so forth. And so I've always campaigned as a pro-life candidate. I've been subject to a lot of criticism and ridicule, and that just comes with the territory. But when you win an election following that vetting experience, then you have a sense of clarity about, yeah, this is what we should be doing. So those are the types of things that come quicker and easier. Things that are not so quick and easy may have foreign policy implications or linkages between various foreign policy efforts, and are you linking a particular appropriations bill to a human right element in a particular country, or are you trying to look out for your country's best interest? And there's a lot of tension in those types of things, and they're not particularly clear about how to approach them. Yes. So have we been able to rely on law and justice and change things that are unjust? And I'll give you an example that's fairly fresh. The tax collecting authority in the United States, the Internal Revenue Service, also known as the IRS, we learned that they were abusing small business owners. They were putting them under a false accusation of wrongdoing. They were then pressuring them to pay a $50,000 fine. All the while, they had completely cut off their access to the banking system. So it would be as if someone came up and grabbed your throat and kept you from breathing until you paid them money. Okay, this is I'm simplifying it, but I'm not overcharacterizing it, or I'm not mischaracterizing it. So this came to our attention. So what do? Well, I went to John Lewis and said, John, this is outrageous. Do you agree with me? And he said, yes, I agree with you. It's outrageous. So we were able to put together a bipartisan, meaning both political parties came together around this idea that this was terrible. We then confronted the taxing authorities, who told us at the beginning, this isn't happening. You're oversimplifying it. These people are guilty of various things, and they should pay this $50,000 fine. Well, it turns out the taxing authority was wrong, and we kept pressure. I was chairing the subcommittee that had the authority here, so I was able to hold hearings to bring in the taxing authority, and I brought in the witnesses about what was going on, brought in other experts, brought in think tank people, brought in lawyers, and we continued to put pressure on the taxing authority to the point at which they admitted finally that they had done wrong. So with the admission came restoration of the money to people. They repaid money. And this was nearly $20 million that they had done this to. It was a pattern. They changed their policy then, their internal policy, and then we worked to change the underlying law to take away their authority to do that in the future. So we were able to use all of these different tools. But at the very beginning, me just calling them up and saying, hey, this is a terrible thing that they're doing, they didn't care. They've seen people like me come and go, and they're like, I don't care. But we were able to be persistent, and then we ultimately put so much pressure on them that they backed off. So the question was, can you explain how this had an impact on your family? And particularly votes in the public eye. I would say I didn't hear too much about votes per se, although I was sitting at our dinner table once when our sons were still at home in high school, and they were asking me questions about some internet policy. And I thought, wow, these people got to my children, I mean, my kids are working me at the dinner table on this issue. And but that was kind of the only thing like that happened. But it's challenging to be in public life, and particularly in a number of the campaigns where the children were out campaigning with Elizabeth, and they would hear very harsh things said about their father. And fortunately, they didn't believe it, and they still would love me and support me. But family life is very, very challenging. And I'm very fortunate that Elizabeth was with me completely on this whole adventure that we've been on. And she was the type of person that when I would walk out the door, she'd make me feel like Rocky, walking out for the big fight. And I felt incredibly supported by my wife and my children, which allowed me to be, I think, more effective. If Elizabeth had not been supportive of me, I wouldn't do it. I don't have the capacity to do it. So, but I think our children grew up and are fairly sophisticated politically, as you can imagine, and have strong opinions. There's a voting term in the United States. It's a precinct. A precinct is an area of voting, and it's only used in a political context. And one time our daughter got off the school bus, and she was quite young. She was maybe third grade or something like that. And she walked in the house, and she was frustrated with one of her friends. And she said, "Oh, Marjorie doesn't even know what a precinct is." I'm like, "Oh, honey, give your friends a break here, you know?" So you're operating in a little bit of a different environment. So we do have a big two-party system, and it's likely to stay that way in the near future, or the foreseeable future, I would say. There has not been a tradition, as you pointed out, in the U.S. or in U.S. politics of having parties that are explicitly Christian. And it's been the hope and desire to have Christian influence in both political parties. Now, what's been happening over the past several decades is that more and more Christians are sort of finding themselves attracted to the Republican Party, and there's more of a secular dominance right now in the Democratic Party. Now, some people would be outraged that I said that, but they're wrong, and they shouldn't be outraged. That's actually what's been happening. And so I think that there's a hope that there will be a trend and a shift back within both of these parties, but at some level, they're representing very different philosophies, and these different philosophies then manifest themselves out in different policies. So we don't have explicitly Christian political parties, but we have places where Christians, bless you, tend to gather. So the question was sort of maintaining your integrity when you're in Washington and away from your family and in public life and so forth. And how do you do that, or is that an easy or a difficult enterprise? The angels literally started playing when you asked that question. Yeah, yours was the voice of the Lord, Nola. So to sort of put this into a larger context, there's you're going back and forth every week from Washington to your constituency. So I would get on an airplane on Monday, and I would fly to Washington. Usually I would come back on Thursday. So every week I'm interacting with Elizabeth and the children. And then with some frequency, I mean more now than when the children were young, Elizabeth would come with me to Washington and was very much a part of things. So our family was very well integrated into Washington life, and a lot of members of Congress knew our kids. When we would do events, people knew our kids. Relationships and friendships have developed from, with our children to other people, political people that are independent of us. So I was always felt like I was well surrounded by my family, and I was not isolated. Now, there's a lot of situations though where members of Congress, I would assume this is the same thing for MPs and peers and so forth, that go away to college. They go to campus for the first time in a long time, and they have sort of a wild freshman experience, and it's not a good situation. I was fortunate to be insulated from a lot of that, and I think some of that is a little bit overstated too, because the rules have changed and a lot of the interactions have changed. So I felt like I was spared of a lot of that. Yeah, so the question is, how do you operate within a political party and maintain your integrity? And look, when you're in politics, basically, you pick a tribe that you're going to spend time with. You're going to pick a team. And then when you join the team, what you've got to do is be very careful about picking battles with your own team. And there's a level of trust that develops in a team framework. So in legislative bodies are so big, and they cover such a massive subject matter that you cannot master it all. So you've got financial services and foreign affairs and military affairs and health and science and taxation and all these other things. And the way you structure yourself is you rely on people that concentrate on energy policy, for example, to at least inform you. And these are the MPs, these are the members of Congress that are spending their time in the hearings, developing the policy, and then they're coming to you to say, okay, this is what we've come up with, can you support it? And there's a level of trust. You understand who they are, you understand their worldview. You're not able to give chapter and verse expertise on everything that they know because they've spent so much time on it, and you're trusting them. Now, they've got an obligation to sort of sell you and to bring you along, but you're trusting them. Similarly, I spent a lot of time on tax policy, and I would work tax policy, and I expected that if I was putting a good package together, that my colleagues in my party would support me and they would vote for me. Now, every once in a while, though, gets wild. Every once in a while, someone will come up with an idea in your own party that's ridiculous. Like, I'm not for that. And so I was in the party leadership, and the Speaker of the House was about to put a bill on the floor as it relates to the Iran sanction or the Iran deal that I was not happy about. So I called him at home. I intervened. I could tell he was yeah-yang me, like yeah, all right, that sounds, it's really, okay. And he was not going to move. He was going to put this bill on the floor, which is a bad bill. And I realized I had to go and get a lot of other people to support me. And I went and I got a lot of other people, and then went back to him when I had all these other people that I'd lined up. And I said, and in Congress, you're taking down a rule. So just parenthetically, the House of Representatives is a unique institution in that it's got a rule book, but it doesn't really matter. So the rule book then there is a rule that gets applied to each piece of legislation. It's a little overstated when I say the rule book doesn't matter, but more importantly, a rule gets applied to each piece of legislation. So first you vote on the rule, and if you're in the majority party, you always vote yes on the rule. Because you've got to. It creates total chaos if you don't. You got to keep it moving. And then you can vote wherever you want on the underlying bill. But what I realized was I've got to, and we call it take down the rule, which is very provocative. I'm shaking. It's very provocative. And it's very aggressive. And it's basically telling the speaker, you don't know what you're doing. It's very provocative. Did I say it's provocative? Yes. So I went to the speaker and I said, I'm going to vote against your rule. And he's a friend. He's like an ally of mine. I'm going to vote against your rule. And I've got 40 other people that are going to vote against your rule too. And at that point he said, okay, let me think about it. He was no longer yeah-yang me. He knew he had a problem. And he came back and he offered this, that, and the other thing. And it was exactly what I wanted. And I can take yes for an answer. And I said, thank you very much. And the whole thing went away. Now, if you're doing that every day, you're going to lose credibility. But if you're doing that with care and with consultation and with a little bit of trepidation, then you can have some influence. Mm-hmm. So the question was, how do you interact with party leaders, and particularly, how did I interact with the party leader of Donald Trump, and sort of what's that like, and how do you have influence? So I was very involved. I chaired the tax policy subcommittee in Congress during the big tax reform debate. And so we updated our tax code for the first time in 30 years, and it was a very large enterprise. And we worked closely with the White House. And I was involved in several meetings that were fairly small, not one-on-one, but kind of this sort of group with the president. And in those settings, he was very easy to work with. He was not the person that you see on television. He was clear, deferential, interested, intellectually curious, and very easy to work with. During the course of some of those negotiations, he asked me if he wanted me to come in and campaign for me. And I said, no. And he could hear that. He could figure it out. Now, when I did not win the election, the day after the election, he's in the White House and he says, Peter Roskam lost because he didn't take my full embrace. So welcome to my world, okay? So you got that on the one hand, and Donald Trump is a particularly big figure, obviously, and mercurial figure. But any time you're trying to interact, I'm convinced that this really does, in many cases, come down to relationships. So the speaker that I mentioned a minute ago was able to hear me because he knew we had a relationship and he knew I didn't trifle in these things. He knew I was not trying to make him look good at the expense of the group or look good at his expense. Or when we were talking a couple of minutes ago, you can develop relationships with coalitions that develop and that can create trusted relationships. And you can trust one another to disagree on something, or you can trust one another with information that's not going to be abused and that you can revisit. But you've got to be very intentional about building those things out. So I had one interaction with President Trump, and I think we'll close with this. He came back from his press conference in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin, and I just thought it was terrible. And was very concerned about the optics of it and the presentation of it. And I had a meeting with the president and others at the White House that was immediately following his return of that event. And what I didn't want to have happen was for the president to get the sense that nobody cared, that he met with members of Congress and nobody talked about it. And so after the tax meeting, I was not interested in a confrontation across the table with the president, but I went up and I spoke to him one-on-one. And I positioned myself, like you do this, positioned myself between him, the cabinet room, and the Oval Office. There's a spot. And so I positioned myself right there and I said, Mr. President, could I give you something to consider on Russia? And his first word was, quickly. Okay, so you know where this is going. He's starting to shut down. And essentially, I made the point that 3 or 4 years ago, I'd been in Jerusalem, and I explained that I'd been with Natan Sharansky, the Jewish refusenik, who now lives in Israel. And the Soviets had put Sharansky in the Gulag. And when Ronald Reagan famously gave his speech calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, Natan Sharansky, as a prisoner of the Soviets, heard about that speech in the Gulag, and he said he knew it was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. He said when the American president spoke with clarity and moral authority, there's no voice like it, and it was the beginning of the end. And I related that to President Trump. I said, Mr. President, when the Ukrainians, for example, see you sitting down with Vladimir Putin in this way, and he wouldn't have it. He just was not interested in the discussion, and he pretty much gave me a full Donald Trump shutdown. But I felt like it was important to raise this issue, and I knew I was not going to get a level of satisfaction from him saying, Peter, great point. Okay, I knew that wasn't going to happen. But I hoped what would happen was that it would influence him, that it would be part of his consideration and part of his calculation. So that's, sometimes there's things that are sort of head-on and direct, and sometimes there's a quiet word, and that was more in the quiet word category.